Hello, welcome back. It is a new day, a new sleigh, and a new video where I have something to say, and I am so excited to talk about this book that I read for the month of August. So this is actually a book that just came out, I think like last week or 2 weeks ago. It is very recent, and I have been tracking the release of this book since I want to say like May, or honestly really early on in the year, because I saw the cover, I saw the summary, and I fell in love. So allow me to introduce to you the one, the only Strange Folk by Alli Dyer, which I hope is how you pronounce your name. I'm so sorry if that is not. So Strange Folk is a magical realist fictional novel, which me personally, I love magical realism. Aside from consuming a lot of like young adult fiction, urban fantasy, I love magical realism, and I only discovered it like once I got to college, and ever since I have been super obsessed. So in this book, it takes place in Appalachia, and if you know anything about Appalachia, it is definitely the perfect backdrop to a magical realist novel. If you look up Appalachia on TikTok, you will get a flurry of videos about strange occurrences, people hearing sounds at night. It is very, I think spooky would put it a little too lightly, and unnerving mildly. It's truly inexplicable what you'll get when you look it up, and I looked it up once and had nightmares, so I cannot do it anymore. But it is a respectful curiosity that I have about Appalachia. Would I ever go there? No, because me as a person, I'm not going to go into the haunted house that makes creaky noises. I'm not going to mess with that. I'm not going to disrespect anything that might be there. So in this book, our main character, Opaline, aka Lee, is returning back to her hometown in Appalachia. She is in the middle of a divorce with her husband, and she has left with her two children, that being Meredith and Cliff. Lee goes back home, but her family is something of a magical family. The town calls them witches, but they don't necessarily see themselves that way. They are more in tuned with the earth and are able to use its magical properties to, do spells, quote unquote, hexes, and things of that nature. While they are at Lee's hometown, they find out that one of the beloved teachers at the local high school has been found murdered. What follows is a lot of unnatural occurrences throughout the town, and people are suspecting Opaline's family of causing these murders using their witchy powers. So the rest of the book is Lee trying to protect her children and kind of keep them from knowing about their magical background. Meanwhile, her trying to figure out what exactly is happening and if it has anything to do with her grandmother. Overall, this book was very, very like creepy and unnerving, but in like the best kind of way. You guys know me. I do not like horror. I do not like scary things. I don't do well with scary things, but this book was so good. I loved it, and I think it's criminally underrated on Goodreads, personally, in my opinion. I will say that this book does, trigger warning, have a lot to do with themes of drug abuse, SA, child SA, and just a lot of very heavy topics. So if you're sensitive to any of those things, I would definitely tell you don't read this book. It's very ingrained in the overall plot. But that was the spoiler-free section of the review. So without further ado, let's get more into the plot and what I liked and disliked about this book. Let me also give a warning that this book does have a twist. So if you don't want to know what the twist is, don't continue the video. If you don't care, please feel free. So first and foremost, what I loved about this book is the way the magic works, because the way it's described is that like Lee and her family have like a natural affinity for it, but it's not like Harry Potter levels of magic. It doesn't like shoot out of their palms or whatever. It's very much that they are borrowing the power that the land has and using it, and kind of like they're kind of conduits, so they are able to direct it and use it for specific purposes. It is very like women centered, where the women in the family, once they get their period, is when they're able to like really fully take advantage of their magical properties and things like that. Although they do mention that like in general, like just the transition of going through puberty is an indicator of like coming into your power as a I'm gonna use witch for lack of a better term. My initial concern when I picked up this book, and this was before I even read it, just by going off the summary, I was worried that they might not handle the setting of the book that well. That being that Appalachia has a lot of indigenous roots and heritage. So I wasn't necessarily sure how they were going to handle it in this kind of book, but I was pleasantly surprised. In the book, whenever they have their like summoning circles, or just like, you know, they're doing a ritual where they're trying to cast a spell and it's all those people, right? They always start each spell with a land acknowledgement. It's not done in a way where it's like, oh yeah, this author's just trying to be politically correct or whatever. They're not like doing it because they want to. It's very smoothly implemented into the narrative, because as we know from the laws of how their magic work, based on what the author is telling us, is that they're essentially borrowing it from the land. It's not something that they have internally. So they start each spell with an acknowledgement of the power that the land holds and where it comes from. So I really enjoyed how it was implemented. And I did see a lot of people on Goodreads say that one of the reasons that they didn't like it was because the magic system was not explained well, or it didn't have like a lot of laws. And personally, I think that that is just a reflection on like not knowing the magical realism genre. But magical realism is not the same as fantasy. It's not going to necessarily go out of its way to establish all these laws and rules. World building is not necessarily the focus, although there is, of course, some level of world building. The main focus of the magical aspect is usually to highlight a certain issue or message that the author is trying to get across. So this is not necessarily a book that I read going into thinking like, okay, well, I need to know every single thing that goes into this magic system. I need to know all the rules. I need to know how it works in order for me to enjoy this book, because there is a lot that is unsaid. And part of it is explained because our main character, Lee, has been disconnected from this magical world. She did not grow up with this practice, so there is some stuff that she doesn't know and she doesn't understand. So narrative-wise, we have a disconnect that helps, you know, strengthen the overall plot. The way that it is explained in the book is vague, and that is on purpose. It's meant to be up for interpretation, because you get the sense as the reader that it's just something that you are like either in the know or you are not, that you might not understand, but these people do, because they are in tune with the earth around them. They are able to communicate with it in a way that we cannot. And in general, that like ominence and like the not knowing of this magic system is what commands so much respect for the characters that are able to wield this magic. And I know I am always the person that is like, I need the world building, I need to understand this, but this is a kind of book where I understand that I'm not supposed to know everything, and it's okay that I don't, because it's not the point. So I'm going to quickly go through the characters. I forgot to do that. So our main character is Opaline, aka they call her Lee. I really enjoy Opaline, and normally I course lean more towards young adult, so I normally empathize more with younger characters. But for me, I really enjoyed Opaline's character. I go back and forth between calling her Lee and Opaline. Personally, I just really like the name Opaline. I think it sounds really pretty. But the reason she changes her name is because, so she grew up in this town in Appalachia, but for college, she goes to either like the city or the suburbs, whatever. She goes to a more highly densely populated area. In an effort to kind of assimilate to that culture, she practices speaking without an accent. She changes her name, and she kind of adopts this new personality. She even starts dating this person who we later find out she will get married to and eventually divorce, and he tries to change her entirely. He knows that she has a quote-unquote strangeness to her, but he tries to make her like this perfect suburban housewife. It like perfectly encompasses the suburban experience, where she goes from having this environment that is full of rich character and culture to suddenly she's eating burrata, drinking wine, and you know, whatever, doing all that suburban shit. And so we see her really struggle with that, especially because she wants to assimilate into this culture, but she can't necessarily abandon her roots. I also really like her character because, as we find out, she does struggle with alcoholism, and the way that it's implemented in the story is very like subtle, because at first it's like, oh well, she's dealing with a stressful situation, she's taking a drink, not a big deal. As the reader, you don't really see any warning signs. But then throughout the story, you realize that every time we're in Lee's perspective, she has a drink, or she is getting drunk, or is actively drunk. And then you realize that the way she explains it is that she wasn't originally a really big drinker and she never had a taste for it, but the only reason she started was for her husband. And I think it really perfectly plays into that like suburban alcoholism, where so often than not, these like rich elites will be like wine drunk. They're always always drinking wine, and it's seen as much more classy and socially acceptable compared to like getting drunk off of beer in a can. And we see the nuances in her addiction as she compares herself to her mother, who is addicted to drugs, whereas she sees herself as someone completely different from her mom, even though we know as the reader that their addictions are the same, even though they're not portrayed that way. And that's because of their different environments. But we as the reader are supposed to acknowledge that this is the same and they're both equally a problem. And it plays into the greater message because, as we find out, the alcoholism and being under the influence cuts off Lee's connection to the magic, to the land. She has to overcome her alcoholism in order to help her children, because later on in the book, her daughter Meredith is kidnapped by a shadow figure, and in order to help try and find Meredith, she has to cast a spell. She has to summon the circle in order to try and like call upon this figure that took Meredith. But in order to do so, she has to stay sober so that she can connect with the land. So we see her struggle where she thinks that she does not have a problem and that she can stop at any time, but her own mother has to confront her and say, hey, as an addict, I know when someone is an addict. I know when someone is too far gone and can't stop. So overall, Lee has a lot of nuances and I really enjoyed her character. I think she was incredibly fleshed out. She was so amazing and I really love her arc towards the end of the story. Then we move on to her grandma Belva. A lot of these names are really interesting too, which I was like, okay, I'm liking this. I'm liking this like country living. So her grandma Belva is like the all-knowing witch person in this town. She's the only person that has the most experience and is the most connected with the land. And I honestly love her character because we see kind of like two different sides of her. Whereas she is someone that is very heavily respected in their community, but as things kind of start to go south and people suspect her of murdering these people, we see them like completely shift on her. And I mean, she is definitely not someone that is like fragile in any way. She's very strong as a character and very all-knowing. Overall, she was just really cool. She brought a lot of character to any of the scenes that she was in, and I really enjoyed reading anything and everything that had to do about her. Then we have Lee's mother. Her name is Redbud. Now, Redbud's character at first is very like ominous because we hear a lot about her, but we never meet her. When Lee talks about her, it's only ever her bad experiences that she's had with her mother. Where at first, when it was her mom and her dad, she had like a pretty normal childhood. But then after her father dies in a bridge collapse, her mother begins to get addicted to drugs. She has a very hard upbringing with her mom, and eventually she leaves for college and never looks back. So once she goes back to this town, she is worried that she might run into her mom, but for the most part, it doesn't happen. And then when she eventually does, we see that her mom is like not the nicest person. She's demanding to see Lee's children and says that she has a right to see her grandchildren. And she is constantly painted as the villain throughout the story, especially as we see her get closer to Meredith and really take advantage of her and her trust. The other big characters we have in the story are Lee's children, that being Meredith and Cliff. One of my criticisms was that Cliff, her son, is like the stereotypical like youngest son that is kind of creepy. Think like the kid from The Sixth Sense where he's like, I see dead people. Like that's Cliff's whole personality, where he's just like there, but also not there. He is essentially the magical GPS of this cast of characters. He's only ever there to give like very ominous warnings, and I think it's honestly kind of criminal that they didn't use his character more. Meredith definitely gets a lot more spotlight in the story, and that's just because she gets her period for the first time and we see her come into her magic. So she gets a lot more screen time in this book, and Cliff is just really, he's like on the sidelines. He is not there for the most part until he needs to be. And I feel bad because that's a lot of the male characters in this book. This is a very female dominated cast of characters. Like we don't even get a perspective chapter from Cliff. We get one from Meredith and Lee, and that's it. Oh, and we get one from Redbud too. We get one from like almost all the main female characters, and we don't get any from the male. And then we have Otis, who is Lee's love interest. They were like childhood friends, I guess. And he only shows up when they're gonna have sex or to be comatose. Like, he is very not present in the story at all, and I felt so bad because I wanted to know more about him. He was giving himbo, and then we don't hear about him until he's like doing the thing, or he's in a coma. And then all the other male characters are just like stereotypical, really like slimy dudes, like the kind of dudes that you gotta cover your drink if you're gonna be around them. And it's kind of unfortunate that a lot of the like moments of tension or like suspense is when the female characters are in a position where they might be taken advantage of, and I don't necessarily like that it was used so often. I think it could have been done better, especially because we're juggling SA and drug use, and it's a lot for one book. I think they should have just stick to one, personally. So the main plot in this book is essentially after Lee and her children come to town, they find out that these people are mysteriously dying, and they all have this black flower like branded into their skin. This black flower grows all over Belva's land, and they don't necessarily know what it is. Eventually Belva kind of comes out and she says that this black flower is distilled, so they turn it into alcohol, which allows people to feel like pure euphoria. Essentially, they feel like they're in tune with the land, and it gives like normal people that experience that Belva and her family have. And she originally created it because Belva's husband was, he was very depressed and she just wanted to help him. So she created this alcohol, gave it to him. He felt the euphoria, but it became highly addictive. So eventually his family started taking the flowers, distilling them, turning them into alcohol, and he like ran away with the recipe. Belva allowed for this to continue to be made on her land in exchange that his family would not interrupt her or her spell casting. So one of Lee's cousins, her name is Kimmy, her brother, TJ, a lot of names, I'm sorry. He is the one that is mainly in charge of distributing this distilled alcohol. And at first, Lee thinks that TJ is the one that has been killing people because the first person to die is one of Lee's high school teachers. His name is Mr. Hall. I also don't like it because his thing is that he was a pedophile. Which, yeah, I really hate that that is like a thing because, again, the SA in this book is just, it's very present. Like, he could have been a Walter White where he was just distributing the alcohol. Why did they make it that he was a P? But anyway, so first he dies, and then the next person to die is TJ, and then everyone's like, oh my god, it is Lee and her family because they were beefing with each other. Come to find out that the reason that all these people are dying is because Redbud, yes, Redbud. So the villain origin story is that Redbud found out that her husband was cheating on her. So she did a spell, she did like a hex to cast away the woman that he was cheating on her with because she believed that this woman was using magic in some way to try to overpower his senses. Essentially, she used a love potion on him. So they did this casting ritual. Unknowingly, Redbud created a shadow figure that was the embodiment of all like her negative emotions. So because she was feeling so strongly about casting this woman away, this figure killed her. Who was the woman? Redbud's sister. I know, the drama. So she ended up dying in the same bridge collapse that killed Redbud's husband. Yes, they have a lot of different names and I can't remember them all off the top of my head. I'm sorry. So Redbud felt so horrible, so guilty about the whole thing because she didn't mean to kill them. She just wanted to, cast her away so that she would, leave and never come back. But knowing that her magic directly killed someone, she decided that she was never going to cast again and she wasn't going to let Lee learn anything about casting. But even though Redbud did destroy her book of spells, that figure was still there. So the way that she explains it is that the reason that the figure killed Mr. Hall was that she was worried that he might try to get to Meredith. And then the reason it killed TJ was because she was wanting to give up drugs and really try and quit. And she was worried that TJ would essentially make her relapse. And then towards the end of the book, Meredith actually gets kidnapped, and that is because Redbud was so angry at Lee for keeping Meredith and Cliff away from her, which personally I was like, that is such heavy favoritism because Meredith and Cliff were together when she was abducted and the shadow figure did not kidnap him. It only took Meredith. If I was Cliff, that would give me some kind of trauma because what do you mean you wanted Meredith so bad? You didn't want both of them? So she finds all of this out from Redbud and decides that she has to recreate the spell that Redbud did to create the monster in the first place to try and summon it back. But she has to do it alone, and that is because after TJ died, the police brought in Belva, Lee, and everyone to question them, and while they were being questioned, Belva had a stroke. So she is currently comatose, unconscious, and cannot help Lee. So Lee has to get back in touch with the land and do everything in her power to try and recreate this spell. She gathers all the people that she can to try and summon it back and uses Redbud to help. They bring back the creature, and Redbud is able to accept all these negative parts of herself, that being, the anger, the addiction, and all these negative emotions, and accept them as part of herself. She absorbs the shadow creature and everything is restored. Redbud brings back Meredith from her hiding place and everything is well. That is until Lee decides that she is going to stay in town and be with Otis happily ever after. And then when she goes to Otis to have their cute little date, he is also comatose. Oh my god. Yep, that is the twist. The shadow monster isn't actually gone. So they figure they must have missed something. Something else must be running amok in these woods. Enter Lee's cousin, Dreama. So Dreama is the daughter of Redbud's sister, that being the same sister that was cheating with Redbud's husband. So Dreama has been involved in the story up till this point. Like, she has been with Lee. But when we meet her character at the very beginning of the book, she is like completely different from all the other characters. She and her husband are developing land in the town. They're trying to make it like a tourist hotspot. She's like rich, wealthy, beautiful, successful, all that good stuff. And she's very much not in touch with her root magic as well. So while they're trying to figure out what happens to Otis, Lee discovers that she has an affinity to walk in people's minds, that being like kind of like look in on them. And Redbud has an affinity for like sharing memories. So Redbud shared a memory with Lee back on the night where she initially created this monster, and Lee realizes that there was another person in the house that night, and it was Dreama. Another thing I like about Lee, she is like the person that Pip from A Good Girl's Guide to Murder wished she could be. She is actually pulling off these secret missions. So she goes over to Dreama's house, not even letting it slip that she might suspect her of anything. So they're having like dinner or whatever. They're just like hanging out, having a few drinks. And Lee will be like, ah ha ha, you're so funny, Dreama. Snatch, grab her hand, look into her mind. I'm sorry, that was a really loud slap. I didn't mean to do it that loud. And she would look into her mind and she's like, oh, something is there. You are hiding something. Ripped open her mind to look in. And then when she realized that Dreama is still holding like a mental barrier to keep her from seeing into her mind, she uses like an herb to knock Dreama out so she can search her house. And she finds out that she has a secret apothecary. Hidden inside, they find Redbud's spell book. So we find out that there's actually a second shadow monster, and this is Dreama's. And the reason she created it was because Redbud essentially killed her mom by creating this shadow monster. So at first she wanted to get revenge on Redbud and essentially kill her, but then she discovered that the best revenge is success. So she decides that she is going to use the magic to become the best version of herself and develop the land in a way where she would be super successful and essentially create a new neighborhood, a new world for herself. So it was actually her shadow monster that killed Mr. Hall. Honestly, the reasoning for Dreama's shadow monster is kind of like, it's not 100% plausible, but I can see what they were working with. And the main reason is Mr. Hall. Like, if he just didn't exist as a pea, I think it would have worked okay. So Dreama killed Mr. Hall because she was like, oh, peas are bad for business. They won't attract new people. And she killed TJ because he was obviously distributing the alcohol and a few drugs, I think. So she was like, that's bad for business as well. We want to attract people here, not scare them away with addiction. But she didn't want Lee to stay in town because she didn't want anyone else to have a connection with the land. She wanted to be the only witch in town because she was essentially afraid that Belva and Lee's entire family line would be more powerful than her and would eventually figure out that she was able to use magic. Because at first they thought she couldn't. They thought that she just didn't have an affinity for it. So when she found out that Lee was going to stay in town, she was like, oh, well, might as well kill Otis, then she'll leave. So what follows is a magical battle between these women. So it's Belva, who has just now woken from her stroke, her comatose stroke. Redbud Meredith is there, yes, because she is also magical and witchy, and Lee. And together they confront Dreama and take down the shadow monster. Again, who is missing from this fight? Cliff. Even though he does have magic and he's a part of the family, he's not invited because he's a man. I'm just kidding. I think the main reason was that he was young and they were like, you shouldn't be involved in this. This is very dangerous. But I feel bad for him. Why isn't he there? In this battle, Dreama essentially almost wipes the floor with them, and the only reason that they're able to turn the tide is because Lee goes into Dreama's mind, and she's essentially going through her mind palace and finds out that the root cause of all of Dreama's motivations and why she's doing everything is because she feels guilty for what happened to her mother. She heard that her mom and Redbud's husband were planning on running away. She knew that they were having an affair and she did nothing. So she ran to Redbud's house on the very same night that she was casting that spell. She saw the figure in the woods and she knew that something bad was going to happen to her mom and didn't warn her. So even though she was blaming Redbud, Lee, their whole family, everyone, she really felt all that guilt on herself because she thought it was her responsibility and that she should have said something to her mother to warn her. This whole scene really plays into the magical realism aspect of this book because again, we're seeing a greater message that this book is trying to convey, that being the trauma that we deal with. Because when she's looking in Dreama's mind, the person that she's talking to is a very young version of Dreama. So we see that she's carrying all this guilt from childhood. But in her little mind palace, which is taking place in Dreama's house, she's able to find her mother. And it's with Lee's help that she goes to her mother and talks to her and finds out that she does not blame her for anything that happened. Her mother says that she had so much love for Dreama and her brother. Yes, he existed. He died before the story happened. Anyway, she had so much love for them and she would have never actually abandoned them. She was just caught up in the moment and she would have turned around. And she said that she felt guilty for leaving them, but she did not blame Dreama for anything that happened. So together, Lee and Dreama end up going back into her little mind palace, into this fire that we are supposed to visualize as the motivation that she has for all the havoc that she's wreaking. And together they have to snuff it out in order for her to kind of come to terms with the things that she's done, start to accept the consequences of her actions. So as punishment, Lee, Belva, and everyone cut off her connection with the land, so she's no longer able to cast spells. I honestly feel kind of bad. But I think that's on purpose because Dreama and Lee are supposed to be mirrors of each other, where Dreama is essentially living that suburban dream. She has a husband, sons, wealth, success, beauty, all these things that any suburban woman could want. Whereas Lee has that strangeness to her. And at first, as she tries to reject it and assimilate, we see her kind of evolve and begin to accept this part of herself. And their character arcs mimic each other, where they start out from different points, but together realize that they need to overcome the traumas that they've experienced in their childhood. For Dreama, overcoming it is by first accepting the consequences of her actions. Eventually, all the spells that she casted for her success, her wealth, and her beauty start to fade away. Her husband leaves her with her children. She's not in a good place at the end of the book, but we're supposed to realize and recognize that this is essentially a consequence for what she's done. And even though we feel bad for her, we understand that this is a step in her path to recovery. And for Lee, we see that even though she is not dedicating herself to the craft and she's not really practicing, quote unquote, she is opening that pathway for her daughter Meredith and for Cliff. So she is healing by doing better by her children. Overall, I really liked how this book ended. Honestly, I thought the twist was gonna be that it was Meredith doing it subconsciously. I honestly would have really liked that if they did, because I felt like the perfect setup was there and all the signs were pointing to Meredith and then it wasn't actually her, and I was like, oh man. But I mean, overall, it was still a good read. I still enjoyed the twist. I enjoyed a lot of the magical aspects to this book. I really like the vibe. Overall, I give this book a 4 out of 5. I want to give it the 5 out of 5, but again, I kind of don't like the way that the essay was handled just because it was so much. I feel like if it was toned back even a single degree, it would be much more manageable. But just tackling all these different traumas and really intense topics. It's hard to do, and it's especially hard to juggle so many at once. I would have liked for it to tone back a little, but again, this is a debut novel. It's not going to be perfect the first time, and there was a lot of stuff that I still enjoyed about this book, so I'm not going to discredit it too much. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I am kind of tired. My eyes feel very red and inflamed. Be sure to read Strange Folk if you haven't already. If you have, which would be kind of impressive, it came out like a week ago, let me know what you think. Does this interest you? Would you be inclined to read this book after my review? Let me know. You can support the author at, I don't know what her handle is, but her name is Alli Dyer on Instagram. And you can also support me on all my social media at Variations of Listen to Kristen on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I am packing currently because I'm going to go on vacation, as I've already mentioned in another one of my videos. I'm trying to crank out a few of these ahead of time. I'm also wearing the same shirt, hee hee ha ha. But anyway, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. I don't know if anyone could tell, but I also got my eyelashes curled. I feel very petite, very feminine. I like it. Anyway, bye-bye.